The undercover agent stood still, his mind replaying the scene that had set everything in motion. It wasn't just another case, it was personal. He remembered the moment it happened, the way it all spiraled out of control on a quiet evening in Birmingham. His brother had just finished his shift, tired but relieved to head home. That's when the police lights flashed, cutting through the darkness, followed by the sharp command to pull over. No reason, no explanation. Just a routine traffic stop, they said. But there was nothing routine about the way things unfolded. The officer stepped out, eyes cold, and it wasn't long before the situation escalated. "Get out of the car," the officer barked, his tone leaving no room for protest. Confused, his brother complied, stepping out into the cool night air. Hands on the hood. "What did I do?" "I'm just trying to get home." "Shut up," the officer snapped, shoving him against the car. "You think you can just drive around here like you belong?" The word stung, slicing through the night as harshly as the officer's grip. "We've been looking for someone like you. Someone causing trouble." The accusation was baseless, a fabricated reason to exert control, to show power. But that wasn't enough. As his brother stood there, hands trembling against the car, more officers arrived, surrounding him like he was some dangerous criminal. They frisked him, forced him onto the ground, their hands digging into his back, their knees pressing down hard, making it difficult for him to breathe. "Why are you doing this?" he gasped, struggling to lift his head and see their faces. "I haven't done anything wrong." But they didn't listen. They never did. And when the chief showed up, the man who commanded respect and fear in equal measure, the look on his face made it clear, this wasn't about any crime. It was about who he was, and where he was, and who they thought he shouldn't be. "Thought you could get away with it, huh?" the chief sneered, leaning down close, his voice dripping with contempt. "You people never learn. This is my town, and I decide who gets to walk free." The humiliation was palpable, seeping into every pore. Neighbors gathered, phones out, recording the scene but too scared to intervene. There was no resisting, no fighting back. That would only make it worse. All he could do was lie there, face pressed into the cold, rough asphalt, hands cuffed tightly behind his back, as they dragged him to the squad car. The news spread quickly. Before the night was over, everyone knew about the arrest. The accusations of possession, of dealing, of being a threat to society, lies, all of it, but they were printed on every local paper, shared across social media, painting him as another statistic. Another man of color, caught doing something wrong. It didn't matter that none of it was true. The chief had already made up his mind. This wasn't about justice. It was about control. It was about sending a message. And somewhere, watching the news coverage, his brother felt the anger rising, burning hotter than it ever had before. This wasn't just an attack on his family, it was an attack on everything he stood for, everything he had dedicated his life to fighting against. How could a man, a symbol of law and order, wield his power so viciously, so recklessly? He knew he had to do something, but the lines were blurred. He couldn't just be a brother seeking revenge. He had to be smarter. He had to be strategic. The chief thought he was untouchable. That no one could touch him, that no one would dare. After all, he was the law in Birmingham. He had seen others try and fail, crushed under the weight of false charges and whispered threats. But this time, he'd picked the wrong family. Because when he attacked an innocent man, he unknowingly declared war against someone who had the training, the skills, and the means to bring him down. "You think you can just walk away from this?" the chief had said, his voice echoing through the precinct halls when they had brought his brother in. "You'll disappear into the system, and no one will ever hear from you again." But that's where he was wrong. Because there was someone who would hear, who would fight, who wouldn't let it rest. And as the agent started piecing together the puzzle, looking through records, surveillance footage, and whispered accounts from people too afraid to speak, a plan began to form. The chief was careful, but not careful enough. Everyone left a trail, and in the tangled web of lies and manipulation, there were threads waiting to be pulled. For every threat, there was a moment of truth. For every lie, a piece of evidence that could tear it apart. The agent wasn't just seeking justice, he was seeking to expose the rot, the systemic corruption, the prejudice that the chief had hidden behind for years. He was going to bring the truth to light, not just to free his brother, but to make sure that no one else would ever have to endure the same. But how do you take down a man who controls the very system that is supposed to hold him accountable? How do you fight back when the enemy can bend the rules to protect himself, when the lines between right and wrong, justice and vengeance, become so dangerously thin? In a place where fear keeps people silent, and power lets the guilty walk free, one man would have to decide how far he was willing to go to see justice done. He'd have to play the game, manipulate the system just as ruthlessly as the chief had, without losing himself in the process. And as the confrontation built to a head, with every step drawing closer to a final, inevitable showdown, there was one thing he knew for sure: he wasn't going to let this go. "You think you can hide behind that badge forever," he said, voice low but filled with an edge that demanded attention. "You're not untouchable. And I'm going to prove it." But could he expose the truth without destroying himself in the process? Could he bring justice not just for his brother, but for everyone who had been wronged by a man who thought he was above the law? The story was far from over. And when the dust finally settled, one thing was certain: someone was going to fall. Hey there, before we dive into this story, we want to take a moment to say something important. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. We believe in justice, equality, and the power of truth. To our Black viewers, we see you, we support you, and we are committed to sharing stories that reflect the struggles and the strength of your experiences. Now, sit back, and get ready for a powerful and intense journey. And hey, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on more gripping stories. Enjoy the show. Now, let's proceed to the teaser. Malcolm Davis had spent years perfecting the art of blending in, of observing without being noticed. It was a skill that served him well as a federal agent. Tall, with a composed demeanor and sharp, watchful eyes, Malcolm was the kind of man who moved through a room without drawing attention, but who could command it the moment he spoke. For most of his life, he had learned to navigate spaces where he was often the only one who looked like him, whether it was in his Ivy League classrooms, in FBI briefings, or at a family barbecue in Birmingham, where the music was loud, and the laughter was louder. Malcolm had always been the protector in his family. Growing up in a tight-knit community, he learned early on that the world wouldn't always be kind to them, but that didn't mean they would ever let it break them. He had seen his mother work 2 jobs to keep them afloat, his father stand tall against prejudice at work, and his younger brother, Aaron, navigate life with a confidence that Malcolm admired. Aaron had a way of turning the smallest moments into reasons to celebrate, of laughing off the slights and side eyes that would have made most people bitter. But Malcolm knew how fragile that confidence could be. Beneath it all, there was a quiet determination in Aaron, a need to prove himself, to rise above the expectations that the world had placed on him simply because of who he was. Malcolm's journey into the FBI wasn't just about ambition, it was about making sure people like Aaron could live without fear, without constantly looking over their shoulder. He had joined the Bureau to fight the kinds of injustices that plagued their community, the ones that often went unnoticed or unpunished. But as much as he was driven by justice, he had always kept a distance, a wall that separated his work from his personal life. That wall started to crack the moment he saw Aaron's name flash across his phone screen, the headline that followed it: "Local man arrested in drug bust." Birmingham was a city with deep roots and even deeper scars. It was a place where the past and present coexisted in uneasy tension. The city had its moments of hope, of unity, but it also had neighborhoods that bore the weight of years of economic neglect and systemic discrimination. Malcolm had seen it all from both sides, as a kid growing up in the city, and as an outsider looking in, once he'd left for college. But Birmingham was still home, and its people were still his people. It's why the news hit so hard. Aaron, his baby brother, had been arrested, accused of possessing drugs and resisting arrest during what was supposed to be a routine traffic stop. Malcolm's gut told him something was wrong from the start. Aaron wasn't perfect, but he wasn't reckless. The story didn't add up, and the more he read, the more it felt like a narrative that had been hastily pieced together to fit a particular picture. Suspected gang activity, they said. Known to associate with dangerous individuals. Malcolm almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Aaron, a gang member. The same kid who'd spent his weekends coaching Little League and volunteering at the community center. No, there was something else at play here. When he reached out to his contacts in Birmingham PD, the walls went up immediately. No one would give him a straight answer, and those who would talk warned him to stay out of it. It's being handled, Malcolm. Don't make this personal, they said. But how could he not? It was his brother, his family. And it didn't take long for him to figure out why no one was willing to share information, because at the center of it all was Chief Richard Hayes. Chief Hayes had been a fixture in Birmingham law enforcement for decades. He was charismatic, well-spoken, and publicly praised for cleaning up the streets. But Malcolm had heard the whispers. There were stories of abuse of power, of intimidation, of corners cut to make the city's crime rates look more favorable. None of it had ever stuck, though, because Hayes was careful, meticulous. He knew how to play the game, how to maintain a reputation that shielded him from scrutiny. But there was always a hint of something darker lurking beneath the polished surface. Malcolm had crossed paths with Hayes a few times, but they were from different worlds. Hayes was the type of officer who believed in control, in order, even if it meant bending the rules. For him, keeping the peace was less about justice and more about making sure people like Aaron knew their place. That's why he'd been there that night, overseeing a routine traffic stop that had somehow escalated into a full-scale arrest. Malcolm didn't need to be there to know what had happened. He could see it in the way Hayes had smirked during the press conference, in the language he used to describe Aaron, as if he was just another statistic, a threat that needed to be neutralized. But Malcolm knew better. Aaron wasn't a threat, he was a target. And Chief Hayes, for all his power, had made a mistake when he thought no one would question his actions. Malcolm was determined to find out why. Why Aaron? Why that night? What was the chief hiding that he was willing to go to such lengths to bury it? As Malcolm began to dig, the layers started to peel back, revealing a network of lies, falsified reports, and a disturbing pattern of behavior that pointed straight back to Hayes. It wasn't just about Aaron, this was bigger, much bigger. There were others who had been caught up in similar setups, each one swept under the rug with just enough plausible deniability to keep the department's hands clean. But for Malcolm, this wasn't just another case. This was personal. And the closer he got, the more dangerous it became. He could feel the tension every time he visited Aaron in the holding cell, the way the officers watched him, like they were waiting for him to make a mistake. Aaron was quieter than usual, his eyes dark with a mix of fear and defiance. "Malcolm, you gotta let this go," he said one day, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're not gonna let you win. They'll find a way to get to you too." But Malcolm couldn't. He wouldn't. This was his family, his blood, and no badge, no threats, no web of corruption was going to keep him from finding out the truth. Chief Hayes thought he was untouchable, that he could hide behind his rank and reputation. But Malcolm had seen men like him before, men who thrived on fear, who thought they could use their power to shield themselves from accountability. As he gathered more evidence, connecting the dots that no one else dared to, Malcolm knew he was getting closer. But the closer he got, the more dangerous the game became, and he could feel the eyes on him, watching, waiting. The stakes were high, and he was no longer just an agent on a case. He was a brother fighting for justice, for dignity, for truth. And he was prepared to do whatever it took to make sure that, this time, justice would be served. The battle lines were drawn, and Malcolm could feel the weight of what was to come pressing down on him. Chief Hayes had made a mistake when he underestimated how far a brother would go to protect his family. But Malcolm had to ask himself, just how far was he willing to go to bring down a man who had built his life on staying one step ahead of everyone else? Malcolm sat across from Aaron, the cold metal table between them feeling like a barrier that neither of them could cross. The harsh fluorescent light above cast shadows on Aaron's face, highlighting the exhaustion that had settled into his eyes. Days had passed since his arrest, and while Malcolm had managed to pull a few strings to get this brief moment alone with him, it wasn't enough. He could see the toll it was taking on his brother, and the anger simmered beneath his calm exterior, threatening to boil over. "How are they treating you?" Malcolm asked, his voice steady but laced with concern. Aaron hesitated, glancing around the room before answering. "You mean when they're not trying to make me feel like a criminal?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "They've been polite. Guess they don't want any more bad press." Malcolm clenched his fists, his mind racing. This wasn't just about proving Aaron's innocence anymore. He knew that clearing his brother's name would mean taking on the entire system that had enabled this kind of behavior for so long. "I'm going to get you out of here, Aaron. I promise." Aaron's eyes met his, a mixture of hope and doubt flickering in them. "I know you're trying, Malcolm. But, these people. They don't play fair. You dig too deep, and they'll come after you too. You think I don't see the way they're watching you every time you come around?" "I don't care," Malcolm said firmly. "They can watch all they want. I'm not backing down." Outside the precinct, Malcolm leaned against his car, the night air cool on his face as he tried to piece together his next move. Every lead he had followed so far had led to a dead end. Every attempt to speak with officers who might have seen something that night was met with tight lips and nervous glances. It was clear that Chief Hayes had a grip on his department, one that was almost suffocating. But Malcolm wasn't about to let that stop him. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a text from an old friend, Marcus, who still worked in Birmingham PD. They hadn't spoken much since Malcolm joined the FBI, but Marcus was one of the few people Malcolm trusted to give him straight answers. "Meet me at the usual spot. Midnight." The message was short, but Malcolm understood. Marcus wouldn't reach out like this unless he had something important to say. As Malcolm drove through the quiet streets of Birmingham, he thought about the risks Marcus was taking just by agreeing to meet him. It reminded him how dangerous Hayes' influence had become. The usual spot was a small, run-down diner on the edge of town. They'd spent hours here as teenagers, dreaming about the future over greasy burgers and stale coffee. When Malcolm arrived, Marcus was already seated in a booth at the back, his eyes scanning the room nervously. "Marcus," Malcolm said, sliding into the booth, "you've been avoiding my calls. What's going on?" "Keep your voice down," Marcus whispered, glancing around. "You have no idea how deep this goes, Malcolm. You're walking into a hornet's nest." "I don't care how deep it goes," Malcolm replied, leaning in. "I'm getting my brother out of this, and if Hayes is behind it, I'll take him down." Marcus sighed, rubbing his temples. "That's just it, man. Hayes isn't just behind this, he is the system. He's got people in his pocket, Malcolm. Judges, DAs, even some higher-ups you wouldn't expect. Aaron's not the first, and he won't be the last if this keeps up." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Hayes orchestrates these busts. He picks targets, mostly black men who won't put up much of a fight, and he makes sure the evidence falls into place. No one questions it because they're too scared, or they owe him favors." Marcus's voice trembled slightly, and for the first time, Malcolm saw just how terrified he was. "There's more, but I can't talk about it here." "You've got to be kidding me," Malcolm muttered, his stomach twisting. "He's running a racket, using his badge to destroy people's lives just to keep himself in power." Marcus nodded, his eyes darting to the entrance as a couple of late-night diners walked in. "And if you're planning to take him down, you need to be ready. Because he won't go down easy, Malcolm. He's already making moves to cover his tracks, and he's got eyes on you. Malcolm's mind was spinning. If what Marcus was saying was true, then this was bigger than he'd imagined. Hayes wasn't just corrupt, he was dangerous. And going after him meant going against an entire network that protected him. But that didn't change Malcolm's resolve. It only made it stronger. Then I'll need proof, Malcolm said, his voice steady. Something concrete. Something he can't spin or bury. Marcus hesitated, then pulled a small flash drive from his pocket. This is all I could get. Surveillance footage from that night. I managed to copy it before they could erase it, but it's not much. You're gonna need a lot more than this if you want to bring Hayes down. Malcolm took the drive, his heart pounding. Thank you, Marcus. I mean it. I'll figure out the rest. Just, be careful, okay? Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. Hayes doesn't lose. He doesn't just destroy people's careers, he ruins their lives. And if he thinks you're a threat, he'll come for you. As Malcolm drove back, the streets of Birmingham seemed darker, more oppressive. He replayed Marcus's words in his head, trying to find a way through the maze of lies and deceit. He knew that Hayes would be watching him closely now, but he also knew that he couldn't stop. Not when Aaron's freedom, and possibly his life, depended on it. The next morning, Malcolm met with his superior at the bureau, Special Agent Henderson, a no-nonsense woman who had seen her fair share of difficult cases. I need your help, he said bluntly, laying out what he had learned. Hayes is running a criminal operation, and I can't take him down alone. Henderson raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. You're asking me to authorize a covert investigation into a police chief with no solid evidence, just the word of one of his own officers? No, Malcolm said, sliding the flash drive across the table. I'm asking you to back me up while I get the evidence. Hayes is careful, but he's not invincible. There are cracks in his armor, and if I can find them, we can take him down. Henderson studied the drive for a moment, then looked up at Malcolm. You're putting your career on the line here, Davis. If you fail, if you can't prove this, it won't just be your brother paying the price. Are you prepared for that? Malcolm's eyes were unwavering. I am. She sighed, leaning back in her chair. All right. But you better be ready, because if Hayes gets even a hint of what you're doing, he'll come at you with everything he's got. The stage was set, and Malcolm knew there was no turning back. The tension was mounting, and he could feel the noose tightening around both him and Aaron. But for the first time, he also felt a glimmer of hope. He had allies, a plan, and now, he had something that could expose Hayes for who he really was. The only question was, would it be enough? And as Malcolm prepared to dive deeper, knowing that every step brought him closer to the truth, and closer to danger, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more at stake than he realized. Something bigger, something Hayes was desperate to hide. And if he wasn't careful, Malcolm might just find out exactly what it was, the hard way. The precinct was quiet, but Malcolm could feel the tension in the air as he walked through the dimly lit hallway, his footsteps echoing off the cold, tiled floor. It had taken weeks of sleepless nights, countless dead ends, and a few close calls, but he finally had everything he needed. The flash drive from Marcus had been the first step. Since then, he'd managed to dig deeper, pulling files, piecing together testimonies, and even setting up discreet meetings with those who had been wronged by Hayes's operation. Each piece had led him closer to the truth, and now he was ready to expose it all. But to do that, he needed to confront the man at the center of it. Chief Richard Hayes was waiting for him, seated behind his polished mahogany desk, a look of feigned calm on his face. Malcolm had requested this meeting, but he knew Hayes well enough to realize that the man had his own agenda. Hayes was dressed immaculately, as always, his uniform crisp, his posture relaxed. He didn't look like a man about to be exposed, he looked like someone who believed he was untouchable. Agent Davis, Hayes greeted, leaning back in his chair with a smug smile. To what do I owe the pleasure? I heard you've been busy. Malcolm met his gaze, unflinching. I'm here to talk about Aaron. About the charges you've placed against him. Hayes's smile widened, a flash of amusement in his eyes. Ah, yes. Your brother. I must say, it's a shame, but the law is the law. He was caught with drugs, resisting arrest. Cut the crap, Hayes, Malcolm interrupted, his voice sharp. We both know he was set up. And I have proof. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Hayes's smile faltered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered, raising an eyebrow. Proof? That's a bold claim, Agent Davis. You'd better be careful, throwing around accusations like that. Malcolm reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folder, tossing it onto the desk. I don't need to be careful, Hayes. You do. That's a copy of surveillance footage from the night Aaron was arrested, unedited. It shows your officers planting the drugs in his car. I also have audio recordings, witness statements, everything I need to bring you down. Hayes's eyes darkened as he flipped through the folder, but he maintained his composure. You've really been busy, haven't you? He closed the folder, placing it gently back on the desk. But you should know that these things have a way of disappearing. Evidence gets lost, witnesses forget. That's just the way things work around here. Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. Not this time. I've already sent copies to the FBI, the DOJ, and a few reporters I trust. If anything happens to me, this goes public. So if you think you can just make this disappear, think again. Hayes's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of their confrontation hanging in the air. Then, slowly, Hayes leaned forward, his tone low and menacing. You think you can threaten me? I've been doing this a long time, Davis. I know how to handle people like you. You're just a kid playing a game you don't understand. Malcolm didn't flinch. No, I understand it perfectly. You've been using your position to target people, to intimidate them, to keep them silent. But it ends today. You're not going to ruin Aaron's life. Not anymore. For the first time, a flicker of anger crossed Hayes's face. And what makes you think you can stop me? He snapped, his voice rising. You think anyone's going to believe you over me? I'm the chief of police. I've got this city in my pocket. You're just a desperate man trying to save his brother. Malcolm stepped closer, his voice calm but steely. I don't need them to believe me. I just need them to see the truth. And when they do, you'll be the one who's desperate. Hayes's eyes narrowed, and he stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. You don't get it, do you? Even if you have all the evidence in the world, it won't matter. I control the narrative. I decide who gets punished and who gets to walk away. And that's where you're wrong, Malcolm said, his voice unwavering. You've been controlling the narrative for too long, but you've gotten sloppy. You've made mistakes, and I'm going to make sure everyone sees them. Hayes stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then, he let out a slow, mocking laugh. You really think you can bring me down? Fine. Let's see you try. He reached for his phone, dialing a number and speaking quietly. Send them in. The door opened, and two officers walked in, their faces hard, their hands resting on their holsters. Malcolm tensed, but he held his ground, even as they moved to flank him. Hayes watched him, his smile returning. You didn't really think I'd let you walk out of here after threatening me, did you? Malcolm's heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay calm. I figured you'd try something like this. But I was hoping you'd be smart enough not to. Hayes raised an eyebrow. And why's that? Because I'm not the only one here, Malcolm said, pulling out his phone and pressing a button. Say hello to the press. For a moment, Hayes looked confused, but then a voice crackled through the phone speaker, and Malcolm smiled. "This is Malcolm Davis, speaking from the Birmingham Police Department. I'm here with Chief Hayes, who has just tried to intimidate me into silence. I'd like to introduce you to my colleagues from Channel 6 News." The door to the office burst open, and a group of reporters and camera crews filed in, their cameras already rolling. Hayes's eyes widened in shock as they surrounded him, the flash of cameras lighting up the room. "Chief Hayes, is it true that you've been involved in planting evidence?" one of the reporters shouted. "Do you have any response to the allegations of corruption and abuse of power?" For a moment, Hayes was too stunned to respond. Then, his expression twisted into a mask of fury. "Get them out of here," he shouted, but it was too late. The reporters pressed closer, microphones thrust forward, their questions overlapping in a chaotic barrage. Malcolm stepped back, watching as the scene unfolded, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and satisfaction. This was it. This was the moment he had been working towards. But he wasn't done yet. "I'd also like to introduce a special guest," he said, raising his voice over the commotion. "Aaron Davis." There was a murmur of surprise as Aaron entered the room, flanked by 2 FBI agents. He looked tired but determined, his eyes meeting Hayes's with a steely resolve. "You thought you could destroy me, but you failed," Aaron said, his voice clear and strong. "And now, the world is going to see who you really are." Hayes's face contorted with rage. "This is a setup," he snarled. "A desperate attempt to save it," Malcolm interrupted, stepping forward. "We have everything we need to prove what you've done. The surveillance footage, the recordings, the testimonies. It's over, Hayes." The room fell silent, the reporters hanging on every word. Hayes glanced around, his eyes wild, searching for a way out, but there was none. The cameras were rolling, and the truth was finally coming to light. "You'll regret this," Hayes hissed, his voice barely audible. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Malcolm stepped closer, his voice calm but filled with determination. "No, Hayes. You have no idea who you were dealing with. You thought you could silence us, but you underestimated how far I would go to protect my brother, and to protect this city from people like you." As the FBI agents moved to place Hayes under arrest, the room erupted into a flurry of activity. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and Hayes was led away, his hands cuffed behind his back. He glared at Malcolm one last time, but there was nothing left to say. The narrative had shifted, and for the first time, he wasn't the one in control. Malcolm watched as they took him away, his heart still racing, but a weight lifting off his shoulders. It wasn't just about Aaron anymore. It was about every person who had been silenced, every life that had been ruined by a man who thought he was above the law. And as the reporters continued to press for details, Malcolm knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more investigations, more arrests, and more revelations. But for now, justice had been served. The cameras continued to roll as Chief Hayes was led out of the precinct, but the chaos wasn't over. Malcolm could see the ripple of tension spreading through the building. Officers whispered to one another, their eyes darting nervously as they tried to make sense of what was happening. It was like watching a dam begin to crack, the pressure building until it was about to burst. And in the midst of it all, Malcolm stood firm, knowing that this was just the beginning of a much larger reckoning. Aaron stepped forward, his gaze steady, yet Malcolm could see the emotion simmering just beneath the surface. This was the first time Aaron had been allowed to face Hayes without handcuffs, without fear of being manhandled or silenced. He walked up to the disgraced chief, his steps deliberate, his expression unreadable. Malcolm could tell this moment meant more to Aaron than he could express, a chance to finally reclaim some of the dignity that had been stripped away from him. "Look at me," Aaron said, his voice low but steady. Hayes hesitated, his eyes flickering with a mix of defiance and desperation. "Look at me, Chief. Because I want you to remember this. I want you to remember the face of the man you tried to destroy." Hayes turned, his lips curling into a sneer. You think this changes anything? You're still nothing. Just a pawn in your brother's game. You're lucky I'm even acknowledging you. Aaron's jaw clenched, but he didn't look away. No, I'm not the one who's lucky. I'm the one who survived. I'm the one who didn't let you break me. And now, you're the one who's going to answer for everything you did. Malcolm watched the exchange, his heart pounding. He could feel the weight of every word, every unspoken thought between them. This wasn't just about clearing Aaron's name, it was about confronting a man who had spent his life manipulating others, using his power to control and intimidate. Malcolm stepped closer, his voice cutting through the tension. You know what your problem is, Hayes? Malcolm said, his tone calm but edged with steel. You thought you could control everyone around you. You thought that because you wore that badge, you were invincible. But you forgot one thing, people like you always get caught in the end. It's only a matter of time. Hayes's eyes flashed with anger, and for a moment, it seemed like he might lash out. But he was still in cuffs, surrounded by agents and cameras, and there was nothing he could do to regain control. You think you've won, Davis, he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. This city, this system, it's bigger than you. Bigger than your little vendetta. You can't change it. I'm not trying to change the system, Malcolm replied, his gaze unwavering. I'm trying to expose the truth. And the truth is, you're a coward. You're a coward who hid behind a badge and used it to hurt people, to ruin lives. But not anymore. Hayes let out a bitter laugh. You're naive, Agent Davis. You think taking me down will make a difference? There will always be another one like me. The system protects itself. Malcolm stepped even closer, his voice barely above a whisper, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Maybe. But it won't protect you. Not this time. And every time someone like you gets exposed, it gets a little weaker. That's how change starts. One step at a time. For a moment, there was silence. The kind of silence that felt heavy, charged with all the emotions, fears, and unspoken words between them. And then, as if the tension had finally snapped, Hayes lunged forward, his eyes wild with rage. You think you can humiliate me like this? He roared. I've done more for this city than you ever will. I kept the streets safe. But before he could finish, 2 FBI agents grabbed him, pulling him back. That's enough, Chief, one of them said, guiding him towards the door. Let's go. Malcolm watched as Hayes was escorted out, his outburst echoing in the hall. It was over. The man who had terrorized his community, who had tried to destroy his brother, was finally being brought to justice. But even as Hayes disappeared from view, Malcolm could feel the lingering unease in the room. There were still officers, still people in power, who had enabled Hayes, who had turned a blind eye to his actions because it was easier than standing up to him. This wasn't just about one man, it was about an entire system of silence and complicity. He turned to Aaron, who was still standing there, his expression hard to read. Malcolm knew how much this had cost him, how much he had endured just to get to this point. Aaron, he said softly, placing a hand on his brother's shoulder. It's over. Aaron's eyes met his, and for a moment, they just stood there, letting the reality of it all sink in. I don't know, Malcolm, Aaron said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. It doesn't feel over. It feels like there's still so much left to fix. There is, Malcolm replied, his tone gentle but firm. But we took the first step. And sometimes, that's the hardest part. As the reporters and agents began to disperse, Malcolm's phone buzzed. He glanced down to see a message from Special Agent Henderson. Good job, Davis. I need you to come to the office. We have a lot to discuss. Malcolm sighed, slipping his phone back into his pocket. There was no time to celebrate, no moment to catch his breath. But he didn't mind. Because for the first time in weeks, he felt like he was moving forward, like he was making progress. He turned to Aaron, who was still watching him, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Ready to go home?" Malcolm asked. Aaron hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. I think I am." The drive back to their neighborhood was quiet, the city lights flickering outside the car windows. Aaron leaned back in the seat, staring out at the streets he had known all his life, the streets that had felt like a prison for so long. "You know," he said after a while, his voice soft, "I used to think, maybe it was my fault. Maybe I was just in the wrong place, doing the wrong thing." Malcolm glanced at him, his heart aching. "Aaron, but it wasn't," Aaron continued, his voice growing stronger. "I see that now. They wanted me to believe that, but it was never true. And I'm done letting them make me feel like I don't belong." Malcolm didn't say anything for a moment, letting the words sink in. He knew how much it had taken for Aaron to say that, how much strength it had required to keep going. "You've got nothing to prove to anyone," he said finally. "Not to them, not to me. You're here. You're alive. That's enough." As they pulled into their driveway, Malcolm could see the familiar figure of their father standing on the porch, his silhouette framed by the warm light from the living room. He had been there every day since Aaron's arrest, waiting for his sons to come home. When Aaron stepped out of the car, his father rushed down the steps, pulling him into a tight embrace, his shoulders shaking as he held him. Malcolm watched, feeling a lump form in his throat. "Welcome home, son," their father said, his voice choked with emotion. "I knew you'd be back. I knew it." Aaron hugged him back, his eyes glistening with tears. "I'm sorry, Dad." "I'm sorry no," their father interrupted, pulling back to look at him. "You don't have to be sorry for anything. None of this was your fault. And I'm so proud of you, for everything you've done. For standing up for yourself." Malcolm stood off to the side, watching the reunion, and for a moment, he allowed himself to breathe, to let the weight of everything that had happened start to lift. He had done what he set out to do, but he knew this was just the beginning. There were still questions that needed answers, still people who needed to be held accountable. But for now, he was content to let this moment last. Later that night, as he sat in his living room, scrolling through the messages of support and gratitude from people all over the city, Malcolm's phone buzzed again. It was Henderson, this time calling instead of texting. "Davis," she said, her voice firm. "We're moving forward with the investigation into Hayes's network. We're going to need you to lead it." Malcolm felt a surge of adrenaline, a mix of exhaustion and determination. "I'll do whatever it takes," he replied. "Just tell me where to start." "Good," Henderson said. "Because this is bigger than we thought. Hayes was just one part of it. There's more to uncover, and it's going to take everything we've got to bring it all down." As the call ended, Malcolm leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling. He had known, deep down, that Hayes wasn't acting alone. But hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. This fight was far from over. But if there was one thing he had learned, it was that change didn't come easily. It came with a price, a struggle, and sometimes, a sacrifice. But it was worth it. Because for every victory, for every truth exposed, there was one less place for people like Hayes to hide. And as Malcolm closed his eyes, he could almost hear Aaron's voice, calm and resolute, "We're still here. And we're not going anywhere." The storm was still brewing, but Malcolm was ready. This time, they were going to finish what they started. And no one, not even the most powerful man in Birmingham, was going to stop them. The aftermath of Hayes's arrest sent shockwaves through Birmingham, rippling out into every corner of the city. For a man who had once been seen as untouchable, his downfall was a stark reminder of the fragility of power built on lies and intimidation. As news of his arrest spread, Malcolm could see the shift happening. Conversations were different. People who had once kept their heads down, who had been too afraid to speak out, were beginning to find their voices. But for every person who celebrated the exposure of Hayes's corruption, there were just as many who were left grappling with what it meant for the city, for the people who had turned a blind eye, and for the system that had allowed it all to happen. Malcolm was back at the precinct, sitting in a small, makeshift office that the FBI had set up to conduct interviews with officers who were willing to come forward. The room was cramped, the walls bare, and the fluorescent lights overhead flickered occasionally, giving everything a dim, uneasy glow. It felt like a fitting backdrop for what was happening, a system being picked apart, piece by piece, the truth dragged out of the shadows. One by one, officers trickled in, some hesitant, others defiant. Malcolm could see the fear in their eyes, the way they glanced nervously at the door as if expecting Hayes to walk through it at any moment and punish them for speaking out. It reminded him of how deep the rot had gone, how many people had been caught in Hayes's web. But it also showed him something else. There were cracks forming, cracks that could be widened, and through which the truth could finally emerge. "I didn't know it would go this far," said one officer, a middle-aged man with tired eyes. "I mean, I knew Hayes was strict, but I thought he was doing it to keep order, you know. I didn't realize he was setting people up. And by the time I did, it was too late." "Why didn't you say something?" Malcolm asked, his voice steady but probing. "When you saw what was happening, why didn't you speak out?" The officer looked down at his hands, wringing them together. "Because I was scared," he said quietly. "Because I have a family, and Hayes made it clear what would happen if anyone tried to cross him. People got reassigned, demoted, even fired, and some, they just disappeared. I didn't want that to be me." Malcolm understood the fear, but he also knew that fear was what had allowed Hayes to thrive for so long. "I get it," he said softly. "But the only way we can make sure this doesn't happen again is if people like you come forward. It's not about bringing down one man, it's about changing the way things work here. So this never happens to someone else's brother, or son, or friend." The officer hesitated, then nodded, his shoulders slumping as if a weight had been lifted. "You're right. I'll tell you everything I know." It wasn't just officers, either. Community members began to step forward, emboldened by Hayes's arrest and the media coverage that followed. People who had been targeted, harassed, or framed spoke up, sharing their stories, each one adding another layer to the picture of a man who had used his power not to protect the city, but to control it. Malcolm spent hours sifting through testimonies, piecing together a timeline of Hayes's actions, and it became clear that the corruption was even more widespread than he had imagined. There were names that came up again and again: judges, local politicians, business owners, people who had benefited from Hayes's manipulation of the law, and who had turned a blind eye to the consequences. As the investigation deepened, Malcolm found himself facing a new dilemma. It was one thing to expose Hayes, to bring him down for his actions, but what about the others who had played a role? The scope of the corruption was overwhelming, and taking it all on felt like an impossible task. But he couldn't walk away, not when he had come this far. One evening, he found himself back at the diner where he had first met Marcus weeks ago. The place was almost empty, the quiet hum of the jukebox the only sound as he sipped his coffee, lost in thought. Marcus slid into the booth across from him, his expression serious. "You look like hell," Marcus said, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "But I guess that's to be expected when you're trying to clean up an entire city." Malcolm laughed, but it was a tired, hollow sound. "I don't even know where to start anymore. Every time I think I'm close to figuring it all out, I find out there's more. It's like trying to cut off the head of a hydra." Marcus nodded, his expression growing somber. "I get it. But you're not alone in this, Malcolm. People are starting to come around, to see what's been happening. You're making a difference, even if it doesn't feel like it yet." "That's the problem," Malcolm said, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want to just make a difference. I want to change things, for good. But how do I do that when there are so many people still trying to protect the old way of doing things?" Marcus leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "You keep going. You keep pushing, even when it feels like you're hitting a wall. Because that's what they don't expect. They think you'll give up, that you'll get tired and back down. But if you don't, if you keep fighting, they won't know how to handle it. Malcolm looked at his friend, seeing the determination in his eyes, and felt a flicker of hope. It was true, Hayes had relied on fear, on people giving up before they even tried. But Malcolm wasn't going to give up, and neither were the people he was fighting for. The investigation continued, and Malcolm began to see the true extent of what he was up against. There were attempts to stall his progress, subtle threats, and even bribes. But every time someone tried to stop him, it only made him more determined. He knew he was making enemies, powerful ones, but he also knew that he was on the right path. A few days later, Malcolm received a call from Special Agent Henderson. She sounded more urgent than usual, and her words were laced with a tension that made his heart race. "Davis, I need you to come to the office. Now." When he arrived, Henderson was waiting for him, her expression grim. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We have a problem. Hayes isn't going down without a fight. He's made a deal, and there's a chance he could walk." Malcolm's blood ran cold. "What kind of deal?" "He's offering to turn over evidence on other players in the network, judges, politicians, people who could be worth more to us than just taking him down. But it would mean reducing his sentence, maybe even letting him avoid prison altogether." "No," Malcolm said, the word coming out before he could stop himself. "That's not an option. He can't walk away from this. Not after everything he's done." "I don't like it either, but it's not up to me," Henderson said, her tone softening. "The higher-ups are considering it. They think it might be a way to get more people to cooperate, to take down the whole operation." Malcolm shook his head, his hands clenching into fists. "That's not justice. That's letting him win. He gets to walk away while everyone else suffers." Henderson's eyes softened, and for a moment, Malcolm could see the conflict in her expression. "I know. But we have to think strategically. If we can use Hayes to bring down bigger players, maybe it's worth it." Malcolm felt a wave of frustration, a sense of helplessness that he hadn't felt in a long time. He had worked so hard to expose Hayes, to bring him to justice, and now it felt like it was all slipping away. "What about Aaron?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do I tell him? That the man who tried to ruin his life gets to walk free because it's strategic?" Henderson hesitated, then reached out and placed a hand on Malcolm's shoulder. "I wish I had a better answer for you, Davis. But this isn't over yet. There's still time to make your case, to convince them that Hayes needs to be held accountable. You've done it before. You can do it again." Malcolm left the office with a heavy heart, but he knew what he had to do. This wasn't just about taking down Hayes anymore, it was about making sure that justice was more than just a word, that it meant something. He spent the next few days gathering everything he could, preparing to make his case one more time. The night before the meeting with the DOJ, he found himself back at home, sitting on the porch with Aaron. The air was cool, and the sky was clear, the stars bright above them. They hadn't had much time to talk since everything had happened, and now, there was so much left unsaid. "You okay?" Aaron asked, breaking the silence. Malcolm nodded, but he didn't feel okay. "I don't know. I'm trying to figure out how to make this right, but it feels like I'm running out of options." "You've already done more than I could have asked for," Aaron said, his voice soft but sure. "You gave me my life back. And no matter what happens tomorrow, that means everything to me." Malcolm looked at his brother, seeing the resilience in his eyes, and felt a surge of emotion. "I'm not done yet, Aaron. I'm going to make sure Hayes pays for what he did. I don't care what deals they try to make. I'm going to fight this, even if it means going up against the whole damn system." Aaron smiled, a small, sad smile. "I know you will. And I'll be right there with you, no matter what." As they sat there, side by side, Malcolm felt a sense of clarity wash over him. This was his fight, but it wasn't his alone. It never had been. And whatever happened next, he was ready to face it, because he wasn't just fighting for Aaron. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, for every person who had been told they didn't matter. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Malcolm made a silent promise: Hayes wouldn't walk away from this. Not while he had breath left in his body. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. It had been months of grueling investigations, testimonies, and legal battles, but now it was all coming to a head. Malcolm sat in the front row, his hands clasped tightly together, his eyes fixed on Chief Hayes as he stood before the judge. Hayes was no longer the untouchable figure who had ruled over Birmingham with an iron fist. He looked smaller now, diminished, his shoulders slumped and his face drawn with the weight of his impending fate. Malcolm had fought tooth and nail to get here. After the initial attempts to cut a deal with Hayes, he had used every piece of evidence, every ounce of leverage, to block it. He made sure that the stories of those who had been wronged by Hayes were heard, loudly and clearly. The community had rallied, filling the courtroom day after day, making it clear that they wouldn't accept anything less than full accountability. Hayes's supporters had dwindled, and even those who had once feared him were beginning to see him for what he truly was. As the judge delivered the final verdict, the words echoed through the room, each one like a hammer striking a nail into the coffin of Hayes's career. Guilty on all counts. Corruption, abuse of power, evidence tampering, the list went on, each charge a testament to the lives he had destroyed, the trust he had betrayed. Hayes's expression was a mix of disbelief and anger, but there was nothing left for him to say. The judge's decision was final, and Hayes was led away in handcuffs, his career, and his life, ruined. Malcolm watched as they took Hayes out of the courtroom, a sense of finality washing over him. He had done it. He had stood up to the system, to a man who thought he was untouchable, and he had won. But this wasn't just his victory. It belonged to Aaron, to Marcus, to every officer who had been pressured to stay silent, and to every person in Birmingham who had suffered because of Hayes's actions. Aaron was there beside him, his eyes shining with relief and gratitude. "You did it, Malcolm," he said quietly, his voice choked with emotion. "You really did it." Malcolm turned to his brother, a small smile tugging at his lips. "No, we did it," he replied. "I couldn't have done any of this without you. Without everyone who was willing to stand up and speak out." As they left the courthouse, the sun was shining brightly, a stark contrast to the darkness that had hung over their lives for so long. Reporters swarmed around them, microphones thrust forward, cameras flashing. But for the first time, Malcolm didn't feel overwhelmed by it. He answered their questions calmly, clearly, making sure the truth was heard. "This isn't just about one man," he said, his voice steady. "It's about a system that needs to change. And it will. Because people are finally paying attention." The days that followed were a blur of interviews, meetings, and planning. The investigation into Hayes's network continued, and more arrests were made as the authorities began to dismantle the web of corruption he had built. But for Malcolm, there was a sense of peace, a feeling that he hadn't allowed himself to experience in a long time. He had come face to face with the worst of what the system could be, and he had fought back. And he had won. One afternoon, as Malcolm sat on the porch of his childhood home, he was joined by Marcus. The two of them had been through so much together, and now they could finally breathe, knowing that they had made a difference. "So, what's next for you, Agent Davis?" Marcus asked, a teasing tone in his voice. "Going to run for mayor, or something?" Malcolm laughed, shaking his head. "Not a chance. I think I've had enough politics for a while." He paused, his gaze drifting to the street, where kids were playing, their laughter echoing through the neighborhood. "But I'm not done yet. There's still a lot of work to be done. And I'm going to make sure we keep moving forward." "You're a good man, Malcolm," Marcus said, his tone sincere. "This city's lucky to have you." Malcolm smiled, but there was a seriousness in his eyes. This city has a lot of good people, Marcus. People who deserve better. And that's what we're going to keep fighting for. As evening fell, Aaron joined them, a beer in hand, and the three of them sat there, watching the sun dip below the horizon. There was a sense of closure, of healing, but also a renewed determination. Hayes's downfall was just the beginning. The fight for justice, for real change, was ongoing, and Malcolm was ready to lead it, no matter what it took. Sometimes, the hardest battles are the ones that aren't fought with fists or guns, but with truth and perseverance. Malcolm's journey wasn't just about exposing one corrupt man. It was about shining a light on a system that was designed to silence people, to make them feel small and powerless. But change doesn't happen overnight. It happens when people like Malcolm, like Aaron, like Marcus, decide that enough is enough. When they stand up, even when it's terrifying, even when it feels like the whole world is against them. So, what about you? Have you ever felt like the odds were stacked against you? Like there was no way you could make a difference? Remember, sometimes all it takes is one voice. One person willing to stand up and say, "This isn't right." And that voice can inspire others, creating a ripple effect that can bring about real change. What did you think of Malcolm's story? Do you think justice was truly served? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters, and we want to hear it. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Tales of Twist for more gripping, powerful narratives that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.